The moment I lifted my hand to knock, the mahogany door swung open before my knuckles met wood. The entry hall was a study in deliberate grandeur. Marble floors, a chandelier that threw flecks of light like confetti, and a long console table where vases held flowers that had been arranged by someone who received a holiday bonus for making small things look inevitable. For a second, I let the scene register, the way you let a postcard register when you know it will be framed and never sent. Patricia Whitmore smiled, all the way up through the eyes. She stepped forward in the way people do when they are practicing warmth for an audience. She glanced down at my coat, then at my Subaru in the long curved drive, then at me. The motion was quick, practiced, a small inventory happening in a breath. "You must be Ella," she said, and there was a softness under the syllables that had been carefully measured. "Come in, dear, let me help you with that." The help, her tone hung on it like a citrus aftertaste. It was casual, as if she'd offered to fetch the coat for the housekeeper she supposes every family like hers needs. I thanked her and handed over my coat, feeling the exchange close like a minor transaction. Inside, Marcus hovered, half admiring and half ashamed, one of those men who wants to love you loudly, but only when everyone else applauds. He took my coat with the awkward reverence of someone worried about fingerprints. My engagement ring, if you could call the cloudy little diamond a ring, caught the chandeliers and unhelpfully reminded me of the first time we talked about forever, while he scrolled a social feed that had more pictures of other people's yachts than of us. The ring had the kind of flaw that made people squint, as if their eyes could resolve character in the stone. I touched it reflexively, an old gesture of comfort. The house smelled faintly of lemon and old money. The dining room table had 6 forks lined up in precise, intimidating progression, a small architectural plan for social hierarchy. Plates with scalloped edges waited like waiting rooms. The family had placed me at the correct angle to watch. I could have said something right then, called out the look in Patricia's voice, corrected Marcus in front of everyone, spoken the truth about who I was. My grandmother had a way of saying, "Truth without timing is a waste of good fury." Margaret Graham would have laughed at me if she'd seen me preparing to make a scene. She would have been right. Margaret's voice lived in me like a small lamp. She'd been a woman who kept a ledger in her head and a kindness in her hands. She taught me how to iron a shirt, so it seems told the truth about the person wearing it. She taught me to listen longer than I spoke, and she taught me that dignity is sometimes silence, an armor you wear because a better weapon is patience and evidence. "When people assumed you were less than you were," she said, "you learned the shape of their character by seeing what they did when they believed you could be shrugged away." I grew up in a small apartment that smelled like lemon oil and thrift store cotton. By the time I was 29, I was a senior software architect with patents and stock options, the kind of quiet financial nesting that meant I could have bought a house in the vein of most people's dreamless dreams. I never made a show of it. For one thing, my grandmother had ingrained into me the idea that wealth is a tool, not a costume. For another, I wanted to see what people thought I was without the preface of labels. What I learned around Patricia's table, in the precise space between a soup spoon and a thinly veiled compliment, was exactly what my grandmother had warned me to observe. The first course was a soup that tasted like permission, clear, modest, politely bland. Conversation flowed in careful arcs, surface compliments, anecdotes edited for charm, memory rehearsals. Patricia asked about my family with the kind of interest that occupies a room but never takes up space in it. She asked where I'd grown up, and I told her. She asked where I worked, and I said software, with a small smile that suggested I'd rather let ignorance mark her map. It is one thing to be underestimated by strangers. It is another to be measured against a ledger of ambition and found wanting by people who plan to become your in-laws. There were small weapons on the table. Vivian, Marcus's sister, wore a dress that announced success by the cut and nothing else. She spoke a language of brand names and percentages, throwing terms like turnover into sentences the way some people fling confetti. At one point, she tilted her chin and said, conversationally and with the soft cruelty of listing options, "We all know Marcus won't take a back seat in anything. He needs someone who understands the boardroom as well as the ballroom. Alexandra is." Her tone finished the sentence for everyone else, and the room agreed with a little chorus of yeses that felt like seatbelts snapping into place. Marcus looked sideways at me, once, twice, the kind of glance that asks for absolution or at least complicity. He gave me a weak smile and a defense so light that I could imagine it dissolving in the air. That's not how it is. He didn't look angry, he looked uncomfortable, as if a part of him agreed with Vivian's assessment in a way that invited compromise. It was thinly veiled. The Whitmores practiced the economy of implication. They didn't have to scream their contempt. They could let it land in places where it would stick, like fine dust on a polished shoe. The next day, the house staff would wipe it away without mentioning it. At the end of the main course, I rose to clear a plate, an instinct that felt to Patricia like confirmation of the role she'd assigned. She watched me with the mild satisfaction of someone who'd predicted a chess move and found it performed. Later, in the hallway, the argument I didn't mean to overhear made the whole plan explicit. Patricia and Vivian were at the far end, voices lowered the way people lower their voices over precious porcelain. I paused to take a breath of the cool corridor air, the marble under my shoes making a soft echo. They assumed privacy. They were wrong. "I don't want Marcus stuck with a liability," Patricia said. Her voice was measured, like someone reading minutes. "He needs a strategic marriage. For the merger, Alexandra's family will bring so much. We can't have him tied to someone who will destruct him." "She's a placeholder," Vivian answered, with the kind of certainty you give to things you plan to remove. "Someone easy, someone who will smile and let us do the hard parts. Marcus will never notice if we guide him. He will follow his advantage." The word placeholder landed like a knife. It had been catalogued and filed. It was not an insult because it was personal. It was an instruction. I stood still, feeling the hallway tilt slightly. "Alexandra?" Patricia's laugh was short, content, as if the name itself was a currency. "Of course. Her father sits on the right board. It's clean. Little Ella won't be there for long." For a second, the world folded into a narrow ribbon of sound. I pictured the engagement ring, its cloudy stone, a poor echo of commitment. I pictured Marcus's face when he told me he loved me that afternoon, as if offering a public vow he might oil to suit an audience. I pictured all of it lined up as an asset to be traded. I could have stormed back into the dining room. I could have stood on the table and bared that they had misread me. But Margaret's voice was there, not because it was memory, but because it had become a method. She had taught me that truth thrown without structure is wasted heat. She had taught me how to turn someone's assumptions into a mirror. They told me who they were when they thought no one important was watching. I knew then that what was on trial wasn't some small domestic misreading. It was the actual terms under which my life would be considered negotiable. That was not just an insult. It was an operational plan. I stepped into the kitchen instead, set the plate down with a steady calm, and told myself that if I was to consider marrying Marcus, I would need to know whether the marriage would be partnership, or a deal brokered by a family ledger. I needed facts, not feelings. There are people who will call what I did manipulative. Let me be clear. I never set out to entrap. I set out to check. When your future includes other people's hands on decisions about your life, you get to ask for evidence that those hands will hold you tenderly, not pivot you like inventory. That night, I went back to my small apartment. It smelled like lemon oil and the faint, clinging heat of the evening. On my dresser lay my grandmother's pendant, a small, worn gold oval with an initial scratched inside where time had softened the engraving. I put it on and felt the weight of a woman who believed you deserved to know things before you agreed to them. I opened a folder and wrote a single line. Find out if Marcus's family is planning to use him as a bargaining chip. I could have done what most people in my position might have done. Confront, storm out, call my attorney, or call Marcus in a voice that would burn bridges before I could measure the impact. Instead, I began to compile a list of legal, public, and ethical ways to gather the truth. I would follow paper trails and public filings. I would photograph public interactions. I would speak to people who had been burned before. I would ask questions. I would not break into offices or hack servers. I would not do anything illegal. That line was important to me for moral and practical reasons. The evidence had to be indisputable, and the means of acquiring it had to hold up in daylight. The next morning, my inbox had work emails and nothing else. I opened a new browser window and searched public corporate filings for the Whitmore dealerships. There were franchise records, vendor agreements, and small press releases praising expansion. I read them like a person reading the margins of a manuscript, hunting for a misprint that would tell me the book wasn't finished. Public documents told a story if you knew how to read them. Accounting footnotes, ownership structures, and meet the management blurbs sometimes reveal more than 100 dinner table smiles. My training as a software architect taught me to read for patterns. Anomalies that repeat in shallow places mean a deeper error below. I found chatter in business forums about inventory shortages at one of the Whitmore dealerships, posts from vendors alleging delayed payments, a terse press release about renegotiated lines of credit. None of it was explosive on its own, but together they suggested strain. Just because a franchise put on a ribbon for a ribbon cutting didn't mean the books weren't leaning in ways they shouldn't. At the same time, I reached out quietly to a woman my grandmother had once done business with, Margaret's old friend, whose name I had scribbled in the purple edges of her address book. The number connected to a voice that remembered Margaret and who she trusted with her small, straightforward laugh. The woman, who introduced herself as Joanne, did not ask me to explain everything. She understood the economy of discretion. She gave me 2 names and told me to be careful. One of those names was Richard Hartley. I had met Richard once at a summer luncheon years earlier. He was a bookish man with a tidy beard and an expression like a man who'd been burned and learned how to read a ledger for motive.
He had a history with the Whitmores that was complicated. Old business emails, then a falling out that had left him with a grievance and a curious set of documents. Public memory framed him as prickly, but what makes a person prickly is often a finely honed survival instinct. When Richard answered my call that afternoon, he refused to start with niceties. "You sound deliberate," he said. "You came because you suspect something." "I want to know if they're planning to use Marcus," I answered. "If they expect him to step into a marriage that's orchestrated." There was a pause, and then to my surprise he laughed. "So you want them to show you the ledger before they move the pieces?" I met him in a coffee shop that smelled like steamed milk and quiet ambitions. He slid across the table a slim folder. Inside were scanned invoices, emails with thin trails of context, and an old vendor statement with a discrepancy circled in pen. He'd kept copies of things he suspected were wrong. He didn't hand me anything illegal, no private bank records, nothing that required breaking locks. What he had was paperwork that suggested something was off. Invoices paid inconsistently. Vendor contracts altered to favor insiders. A memo referencing special disbursements that weren't codified. "There's more," he said, "but I didn't bring it. If you're serious, you'll need to ask the right people in the right way. I can point you, but you have to promise me you won't burn bridges unless you have to." "Why help me?" I asked. "Because they hurt me," he said simply, "and because Margaret trusted you." It was enough. There are loyalties that outlast collusion. There was also something else in Richard's eyes, a tiredness that speaks when a person has watched the same pattern play out and wants a different ending for someone else. I started to compile what would become the spine of a case, not a lawsuit, but an armor of verifiable facts. Public franchise agreements, vendor complaints posted on public forums and archived by trade associations, a series of social media posts that placed Marcus with Alexandra at a restaurant 2 weeks before our engagement, the photo publicly accessible, geotagged and timestamped. The photograph was taken in a public plaza. That meant it was fair to use as evidence of a pattern without violating privacy laws. Everything had to be traceable to a public or willing source. 3 weeks followed like a rehearsal. I kept attending dinners. I wore clothes that read modest by the family standards, but were carefully chosen, so that when I later changed the narrative, the reveal would be visible. It was a chess game, yes, but also a study in endurance. I learned how to let their small slights roll off like water from lacquer, how to laugh when Vivian made a cutting remark about public school upbringing, how to accept Patricia's offers of help without flinching. People ask if I hated them for it. The answer is complicated. Hatred would have given me a shorter fuse and a reckless script. I felt a quiet indignation, clear, clean, efficient. I wanted information more than I wanted retribution. I wanted to know if Marcus would insist on a partnership where I had agency, or if I would be an adornment for the Whitmore's ledger. Marcus continued to orbit questions with mild defensiveness. Once, after another dinner where Vivian described a fictional philanthropist gala in lavish detail, and then casually proposed the idea of a merged ownership structure where Marcus's name sat where expertise would be expected, I pulled him aside. "Did you know they called me a placeholder?" I asked. He looked momentarily confused. "Who called you what?" "Your mother and your sister in the hallway," I said. "They were planning things." He exhaled a breath I felt as heat against my back. "I didn't hear it all," he said, "but maybe I should have." He wanted me to leave it at that. He wanted apologies and reconciliations polished with promises. He wanted the kind of forgiveness that could be spoken into a microphone and posted as a story. But wanting to believe something isn't the same as being willing to restructure a life around it. And he hadn't asked questions, not properly. He had wanted the peace that comes from not rocking a boat that floats him. I decided then that Marcus would have to choose himself. If he wanted to be part of a family that proposed using him like currency, he would have to come to that realization without me forcing an epiphany. I would give him the space to choose, but I would also arm myself with fact. My workdays blurred into evenings spent following public trails. I pulled trade filings that discussed the dealership's performance. I read vendor agreements where payments mantles had unusual clauses. Special disbursement appears in one memo, with a signature I had not seen in the public-facing biographies. I printed the pictures of Marcus and Alexandra, photographs that placed them in the same cafe at 6:12 p.m., their shoulders within a frame that suggested an intimacy they did not disclose to people like me. One afternoon I met Joan, a supplier who had suffered delayed payments. She spoke without melodrama, just dates, invoices, and the conversation she'd had with a junior manager who had promised remediation that never came. Her name was small in the tapestry of grievances, but together with Richard's folder and the publicly filed notes, it created a pattern. I took everything and assembled it in a way my grandmother would have recognized. A clear ledger with tabs, each document labeled with where it was found and why it mattered. For each piece, I made a note of the source and the date. Chain of custody is a term lawyers use, but I used a version of it in my head. Everything had to be defensible, tomorrow or 10 years from now, if it mattered. On a Thursday night, 3 weeks after the dinner that tasted like permission, Vivian posted a picture on social media of herself and a dealer manager toasting a new quarterly direction. The post was public and tagged the dealership's location. I saved the screenshot with a timestamp. It was the kind of thing people who want to believe in momentum post, and it helped connect months of inconvenient invoices to a narrative of surface expansion masking cash flow problems. I didn't feel victorious. I felt methodical. There's a difference between triumph and careful preparation. Margaret would have nodded at that distinction. She would have said, "You build a case like you build a life, on steady foundations and not on theater." Over coffee with Richard one afternoon, his hand hovered near a manila envelope that smelled faintly of old coffee and newer anxiety. "We have a vendor statement that doesn't match the ledger," he said. "They've been siphoning amounts through an internal vendor setup. It's sloppy, amateurish. Someone close did it." "Vivian?" I asked. He didn't have to answer. His face said it. Small, precise scandal. He slid a photocopy across the table. The handwriting matched a name I'd seen on another memo, nondescript in the way that makes fraud comfortable. "Do we know who authorized these?" I asked. "Only the signatures," he replied, "and those signatures are frankly expected in a family that confuses privilege for permission." I kept thinking about the pendant at my throat. Margaret had been a woman who trusted in facts and the dignity of a tidy life. She taught me to put things in order before you show them to the world. I arranged the papers in the same way she used to fold napkins, clean edges, straight lines. The plan I was writing for myself had rules. No illegal activity, no public accusations without a record, no theatrics until the evidence spoke louder than any rumor. The ethics were as important as the facts. If I wanted them to be accountable, I had to hold myself accountable to a higher standard. I told Marcus I was taking time at work to handle family matters. He believed me because he had already been skating in comfortable interpretations of my life. I did not tell him about Richard at first. I wanted him to know the truth from me when it mattered, not beau-prepped by rumor. 3 weeks turned into a grid of practiced interactions and quiet research. I smiled at small cruelties, counted forks, and traced invoices. I listened to the sound of people assuming when no one important was watching and cataloged them. Every time Patricia offered an offhand kindness that carried an undertow, I filed it. Every time Vivian spoke of arrangements and benefits as if she were listing furniture for sale, I wrote the phrases down. There's a private cost to playing a role in someone else's theater. You have to build patience like scaffolding around a fragile place. Sometimes I felt like an actress who had forgotten her lines, and other times I felt like an agent of a truth that had no other agent. Most nights I fell asleep underneath Margaret's pendant with my folder on my lap, and the hum of my old refrigerator as the only applause. On a Tuesday afternoon, Marcus texted me a picture of a bouquet he bought, an old habit of his to make the ordinary into a ritual. He wanted to know if I would go with him to a dinner with his parents the following weekend. I said yes. Inside, I had already decided to continue, not because I liked pain, but because I wanted clarity. Before I left the apartment that weekend, I pinned my grandmother's pendant over my heart. It felt like carrying a small compass. I wore a dress that read modest, but was tailored in a way that someone who knew fabric would appreciate. I left my expensive bag at home. It would have been a signal. If they wanted to believe I was poor and clueless, I let them, until the day they had to believe otherwise. The night's arrival was exactly the way memory keeps things. Light playing on crystal, muffled laughter, the small clink of spoons. Patricia greeted me at the door with the same practiced smile. "So glad you've joined us," she said, and this time the offer to help with my coat was warmer, as if she had rehearsed a different cadence for her performance. Dinner moved like a well-directed scene. Vivian was sharper than usual, delighted by anecdotes that carried assumed victory. She asked a question about my employment. So remotely, or downtown, and when I answered simply that I worked at a tech firm, she raised an eyebrow in a way meant to separate circuits, brains from breeding. "It must be convenient," she said to Marcus, then to me, like a third-person commentary, to have someone flexible. Patricia made a face like she'd tasted something unexpected. "Flexibility is useful," she added, as if it were the quality one equips portable furniture with. Marcus gave me a look that I could not decode, then turned the conversation to neutral ground. Childhood stories, football results, a weather complaint. He preferred being part of a family functioning as an organism of polite exchange, rather than a body with fractures. At one point, while the discussion turned to the annual golf charity, an event I could recite in my sleep as a social calendar item, someone mentioned Alexandra Castellano. The name landed like good soil. Alexandra, with her sculpted smile and father on the board, had a kind of gravitational pull in their conversations that felt as if she were already seated at a table she hadn't bought a place at. Alexandra is lovely, Patricia said. She understands the world in a way some people just don't. Vivian toasted slowly without looking at anyone. We need people who understand those worlds, she said. I could feel the room rearrange around that sentence. It was a confession of intent dressed as a compliment.
When dinner ended, the smiles were practiced and the departures were swift. Marcus walked me to the door and asked softly if I was tired. No, I said, but I'm paying attention. He kissed my forehead like he was trying to mend a misunderstanding with the same gentle motions he'd used since we were first dating. It was almost enough to make me melt. Almost. I left with the same quiet fury I had learned to keep, clean and focused, like a lamp that warms but does not flare. That night in my apartment, I spread documents like a cartographer spreading maps. Public filings, emails Richard had supplied, screenshots of social media posts, a vendor statement with a suspiciously similar routing number to another account. Each was an island until I connected them. My grandmother's words, "Watch what people do when they think no one important is watching," had become the map legend. I did not yet know what the final contour would look like, but I did know this. If I wanted to marry Marcus, I wanted him to do it as himself, not as a ledger entry. I wanted to be chosen for myself, not for the lines on a balance sheet. When I fell asleep that night, my phone buzzed with a short, matter-of-fact text from Marcus. We need to talk tomorrow. I slid the phone under my pillow and placed a hand over the pendant at my throat. Tomorrow was for questions. Tonight was for being certain that patience could be a weapon, but only because it had been carved from a place of dignity and not cruelty. If this story is the sort of thing you like, hit like and subscribe. There are more nights like this to tell, about how facts are gathered, how pride is navigated, and how a woman decides whether to stay or walk. For now, the pieces are being placed. The strategy is quiet. The test is set. In the days that followed, my investigation deepened. I filed simple Freedom of Information requests where they applied. I pulled franchise performance reports and matched them against publicly reported sales numbers. I saved screenshots of Alexandra and Marcus at a restaurant in a city several towns away, an obvious meet in a public square, time-stamped and tagged. I interviewed, politely and off the record, a former employee of the dealership who confirmed delays in payroll invoices and pointed me toward a name I had already circled. Vivian continued her performance of effortless oppression. She sent me an invitation to a charity event with the kind of note that read like an appendix to a will. It would be good for you to be seen. I smiled, accepting the invitation in a way that would not make a scene. Seeing, it seemed, was a currency they believed they could mint. I had assembled more than suspicion. I had a pattern and a network of small documents that pointed to a larger picture. Richard delivered additional copies of correspondence that were public only in the sense that he had been given them in negotiations years prior. He had kept them because he knew what amateur accounting looks like. The handwriting on one memo matched a signature I'd found on a bank transfer listed as a vendor adjustment. It suggested internal movement of funds that, combined with the vendor statements, did not look accidental. I began to think about how to present this without becoming the story. I did not want to be the woman who screamed and then retreated to the headlines. I wanted to be the woman who refused to be used and who did so with facts that could not be reduced to rumor. I also did not want to shatter lives without cause. There is a brittle line between exposure and display. I kept reminding myself that my grandmother had also taught me compassion, even when using a sharp instrument. The point of exposure is not to celebrate ruin. It is to prevent a pattern of behavior that hurts others and to allow the truth to stand. The next week, a new line arrived in my folder, a letter from the manufacturer that supplied parts to the Whitmore dealerships. It was a terse notice requesting an audit following a vendor complaint and supply disruption. The letter had been public enough to appear in a trade bulletin. I printed it, not because it guaranteed anything, but because it suggested that external actors had noticed inconsistencies too. There are moments in plots you don't get to stage. They happen like weather. A small gust could topple a bird's nest or reveal a nest under the eaves. For me, the gust came as a cascade of small confirmations. The photograph of Marcus and Alexandra in public. Richard's vendor statements, the manufacturer's audit request, the social posts that mapped meetings between the Whitmores and the Castellanos. I began to count down the days, not to a confrontation, but to a moment when I would no longer need to play the part I had agreed to. I would gather the evidence, lay it out where it could be seen, and then I would decide whether to stay married to a man who had let his family call me a placeholder, or to walk away with my dignity intact and my life unnegotiated. 3 weeks was an arbitrary measure, but it had a rhythm to it. The family was comfortable with pacing. They moved in waves of slow announcements and sudden decisions. My plan was to keep the pace until I had no reason to continue. I wasn't sure what the exact moment would look like. I only knew it would be precise, like an argument made with documents instead of with raised voices. On the morning before the day I planned to present the first substantial folder to someone who could act, someone who could insist that an audit be taken seriously, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at my hands. They were the hands of a woman who knew how to build with code and how to fold a napkin.
The pendant warmed against my throat, and I thought of Margaret's ledger. I thought of how Margaret had tucked my achievements away like a hidden reef, and then taught me to navigate the currents. Marcus sent me another text that morning. "Can we talk tonight? It's important." I sent back a one-word reply. Later. There was a dignity in delay that felt like a bridle on impatience. It let people show themselves without my help. It let the evidence breathe. It allowed the Whitmores to continue speaking in the vocabulary that had betrayed them. I wanted them to continue, because the more they spoke, the more they revealed. When evening fell, I gathered the printed documents, each labeled and annotated, and placed them in a manila folder. I added a note, for review. I felt no exhilaration. I felt the clean, cold relief of someone who had chosen a course of action consistent with their values. I had not taken anything illegal to get this far. I had relied on open records, public photographs, and the testimony of people willing to speak in the light. I walked to my mirror and looked at my reflection. The woman who smiled back at me had learned to be patient and not complacent. She had learned to wear the pendant and to let the family think whatever they wanted, for now. The regretting, I told myself, would not be spectacular for its own sake. It would be necessary. It would be precise. And then there was the matter of Marcus, who might not want to be known for being used, who might, when the truth came to light, feel cornered by the consequences of family ambitions. I had to be ready for that too. In the files, I had the photograph of Marcus with Alexandra, public and time-stamped. I had vendor statements with discrepancies and a manufacturer's note requesting an audit. I had Richard's notes and Joanna's testimony. I had the online posts that mapped meetings between executives and families. What I did not yet have was a dramatic public confrontation. I had not yet chosen my venue. But that, too, is a decision that requires timing. You never want to present truth when its echo will be mistaken for noise. You present it when people can no longer ignore the pattern, and when the evidence is tidy enough that anyone looking at it with a clear eye will see what is exposed. I left the folder on the small table by the door. I turned off the lights, but left the lamp on in the living room. Outside, the city sounded like a far-off crowd. I took a breath, feeling the weight of the pendant, the folder, and the quiet knowledge that I had done what I had to do. Tomorrow would bring conversations, possibly with people who had power to act on what I had compiled. But the story doesn't end in my files. It ends when the evidence meets consequences, and when the Whitmores, who had made a habit of using their social capital like credit, have to account for what their maneuvering did not pay for, people's lives. I slid my phone back under the pillow and let the city breathe around me. In the morning, I would begin the next phase, finding the right person in the manufacturer, the right journalist who would take facts seriously rather than spectacle, the right way to present what I had without being the spectacle myself. For now, the test had done its work. They thought I was poor and clueless. They did not know I had been watching. They did not know I had learned how to read a ledger. They did not know that patience, when wielded with evidence, can be more piercing than any public outcry. I slept that night with plans mapped like constellations in my mind. When I woke, I would move forward. The morning of the engagement party felt like stepping into a photograph I had already taken. Sharp light, shadow in the right places, everything arranged to flatter a chosen angle. I moved slowly through my small kitchen, pouring tea with an attention to gesture I had learned from Margaret. Her pendant warmed against my chest as if it remembered the palms that had once clasped it. I had pinned notes to the inside of the manila folder, names, dates, sources, the legal and public origins of each item. Chain of custody wasn't just a phrase to me. It was a promise that nothing I showed tonight would be dismissed as rumor. Richard and I had spoken twice that week, once over coffee and once in a conference room in a nondescript office where the light was fluorescent and unromantic, not the sort of place that made anyone feel sympathetic. He had his own reasons for wanting the truth out.
He had assembled his copies of invoices and emails and sat with a small, fierce patience that looked a lot like contrition. He had agreed, reluctantly, to be the one who would hand a copy of the folder to the manufacturer's compliance officer if I gave him the go-ahead. He would be the whistle of the mechanism. I would be the lock that kept the key. The manufacturer, a large parts supplier with national distribution, had not been eager to act on good gossip, but they were reliable in response to verifiable irregularities. I had made an appointment with a woman named Elena Morales, Compliance Risk Management, who had responded with a tone that was all professional courtesy and the sort of exactitude that made the world safer. Her reply had been short. If you have documented discrepancies, bring them. We will review, and if warranted, we will act. That night, in the fluorescent office with the plastic plants, I put the manila folder on the table between us. Elena opened it like someone who reads maps with their fingers. I need the names attached, she said after the first 5 minutes, and I gave them, precisely as they appeared in the documents in public posts. We will verify the vendor statements, cross-check routing numbers, and escalate if the audit bears out. I watched the way responsibility settled in her jaw. It is a quiet thing to see a bureaucracy take an answer seriously.
She told me, in terms that were efficient and careful, what the manufacturer could and could not do publicly. They could suspend shipping to the franchise pending an internal review. They could request an audit. They could escalate to the corporate board that oversaw the dealership network. That was enough. There were meetings I had purposefully avoided. I did not want a journalist breathing down my neck the week my grandmother's lunchbox was still in the closet. I did not want the story framed as a tantrum. I wanted it framed as a pattern in paperwork. So I kept my name out of the initial contact with Elena. Richard presented the folder as someone with standing and relationship to the Whitmore vendors and requested a compliance review. Elena called her colleague that evening, who placed the flag for an expedited review. She told Richard that if the pattern suggested internal siphoning, and if the photograph and public posts confirmed a conflict of interest or a misuse of corporate privilege, the manufacturer could move quickly. By the time Thursday rolled around, the manufacturer had opened a formal inquiry. Elena was not one to be theatrical, but she did her job with a kind of resolute fairness that made me want to do mine with the same exactitude. We don't operate on innuendo, she said. We operate on documents. I slid the folder across to Richard like an offering. He took it without a smile. You should wear something unforgettable, he said when we parted. He was trying to be gallant, and it landed like an awkward bow, because there was no romance in what we were planning, only accountability. Still, his tact made me smile. I had rehearsed the words I would say in my head for 3 weeks. They were bare at first, facts first, feelings folded into the edges. Then they became sentences with pressure. I would not fling accusations. I would call evidence what it was. I would say what I'd heard, what I'd seen, and what I'd gathered in public records. I would ask institutions to act, and then let them act. That to me was the moral high ground, not to make the spectacle, but to place the truth before those who could weigh it impartially. When I stepped out of my Subaru that evening and walked up the Whitmore Drive, the house looked the way it always did, commanding and practiced. Guests gathered under a tent set with crystal and linen. A musician played the sort of music that makes people smile in the right places. I had chosen an emerald dress that read like someone who belonged in a photograph of a woman with a story. Rich color, clean lines, nothing showy in terms of brands. Over my heart, Margaret's pendant lay like a compass. I had not told Marcus about meeting with Elena or Richard. He did not need to be prepared to soften his face for me. He needed, if anything, to choose. And if he could not choose to stand with me for the truth, then I needed to know that before I took another vow. As I crossed the threshold, Patricia greeted me in the manner of someone who has long since perfected the art of curated warmth. She touched my elbow in a way that said the same as her smile. You are in my inventory now. Vivian, who had perfected the expression that makes cruelty look like an afterthought, approached and managed to be congratulatory in a way that felt like an audit. They had made the party a stage designed to manufacture approval. Tonight, the stage would be a different kind of theater. Guests clustered at their tables as the band softened. I took a practiced conversational route through the crowd, allowing nods and small talk, watching how people extended attention and weighed the cost of giving it. At one table, an executive from a car parts supplier laughed a little too loudly. At another, a manager from one of the Whitmore franchises made the sort of motions that people make when they have something to hide, hands slightly fidgeting, eyes flitting. Marcus found me beside a sculpture of some bronze thing that had been installed because the Whitmores believed in the symbolism of permanence. You look incredible, he said, leaning in with the old tenderness that had once been the home of our private jokes. His hand brushed mine. He did not seem to understand the shape of what I now carried. Thank you, I said.
you're early." "I wanted to be," he said. "It's our night." Our night. The phrase hung between us as if it were still possible. I squeezed his hand for a breath and let the softness be an act of memory rather than belief. The MC called for attention, and the party settled into that smooth pace where people are meant to be part of something and not required to examine it too closely. I had told Richard I would take the mic after his little introduction. He would speak to the facts with a dryness that would make anyone who performance over paperwork uncomfortable. He would offer the folder to Elena and to the manufacturer rep who had been coaxed into attending by Richard's insistence. He would hand the evidence to people who had authority to act. When he walked onto the small raised platform, his face was a study in composure. He introduced himself as someone who had business ties, and then quietly he recited brief things that were headline material if you wanted scandal. Delayed vendor payments, an audit letter, suspicious internal transfers. He spoke with the kind of voice that makes an open ledger sound like a moral argument. Then he looked at me. "Ella has asked me to present these documents," he said. "She asked that I do it because the evidence is public and the matter is serious." I felt the air tilt. Heads turned. Patricia's smile gave way to a tiny disturbance around the eyes. The orchestra stumbled on a chord. I stepped up to the microphone, feeling the echo of Margaret's method in my throat. This was not a performance designed to humiliate. It was a presentation of facts.
My grandmother would have said, "Be precise." "Good evening," I began. The room obliged me with a sound like polite curiosity. "I didn't come here to make enemies. I came here because I had to know whether the life I was being asked to join would be a partnership or a ledger entry." It is striking how the simplest sentences can feel like a blade. The corner where Patricia's voice lived tightened. "I grew up being taught to watch what people do when they think no one important is watching," I continued. "I heard things in a hallway. I collected facts. Tonight, I am not asking you to take my word for it. I am asking you to look at documents, photos, and correspondence that are traceable and public." I explained, briefly and steadily, how the vendor statements were linked to payments that had odd routing numbers, how the social posts placed certain people at meetings on dates that lined up with questionable transactions, and how the manufacturer's audit letter had been issued after supply disruptions and vendor complaints. I did not invent motives, I connected events. I held up a printed photograph of Marcus and Alexandra seated at a public cafe, the timestamp visible at the bottom because the post itself had been public. "This is a public photo," I said, "taken in a public place. The context is not speculation, it is a record of meetings." There was movement at the table where the Whitmore sat. Marcus's hand went to his mouth. His face, which had once been a place of things I could understand, unknotted into something like fear. Maybe that fear was for himself. Maybe it was for the family he had been raised to please. He looked at me as if trying to reconcile which version of truth he preferred. "I heard the phrase placeholder in a hallway," I said, and though the words felt small, they landed with purpose. I heard plans being arranged in a way that would make a person's marriage transactional. That was not a private thought. It was an operational plan. I believe people deserve to know the terms under which their lives are negotiated. The room made that sound people make when a pivot is happening, and you can feel the climate shift. Patricia's lips were a thin line. Vivian's jaw tightened, and for the first time that night she looked as if she wanted something to be done rather than simply to be admired. I placed the photograph on a small easel and slid 3 folders across the lectern, one with vendor statements and notations, one with scanned emails and invoices marked with dates and sources, and one that contained the manufacturer's audit letter requesting an audit. Richard had prepared a binder for the compliance officer and the board representatives who had made themselves visible in the room. The evidence was by design not spectacular. It was tidy. It smelled faintly of printer ink and verification. Elena stood beside Richard. She cleared her throat and, in a voice that carried the weight of procedure, announced that the manufacturer had been alerted and that, pending a formal review, they would be suspending new shipments to the franchise, effective immediately. The room stirred. That phrase, suspending shipments, was a practical move that had immediate teeth. For a family that counted on a steady flow of parts to keep a network profitable, it was significant. Vivian's face went white. She sputtered something about misunderstanding. Patricia, who had always been quick with the language of management, found herself with less to say. The guests murmured. Someone stood up in the tent and muttered about due process, as if the right to cover something up was itself a kind of legal tradition. "It is not my job to ruin companies," I said after Elena finished. "It is my job to bring documents to people who can judge them fairly. The manufacturer has asked for an audit because there are public signs of inconsistency. That is not a verdict. It is an investigation. It is an attempt to ensure that vendors and employees are treated honestly." Marcus stepped forward then, his face a conflicted geography. "Ella," he began.
Marcus, I said, and my voice did not raise but carried the weight of the 3 weeks I had kept my mouth shut for the sake of getting truth. I've given you room to figure out what you want. I told you I needed facts. Facts have been placed where people who can act can see them. I am not interested in embroiling you in a public spectacle. I am interested in knowing if you will build a life with me. He looked stunned and small. For someone raised to have decisions made for them, the sudden clarity was like being asked to perform without a script. I didn't know, he said, in a voice that was almost a child asking forgiveness. You didn't hear it in the hallway? I asked, because I had heard them speak not as dinner talk but as design. You didn't know they were counting on someone to be easy to remove? His mouth opened as if he were searching for the correct cadence of guilt and surprise. He had the kind of defensiveness that sounded like bewilderment. I love you, he said, the line someone once told me he favored, the one that is meant to seal other people's apprehensions into silence. I didn't know they'd. Love is not a pause button, I said. Love is not something you can place in a ledger and call protected. It's not simply a public vow. If your family has been planning to use you, that is something you should know before you put your name to a marriage. The crowd leaned in the way crowds do when the human element becomes the headline. My grandmother would have told me to be sparing with pity. She would have said, choose dignity. I stepped down from the platform with the ring heavy on my finger. I had rehearsed this with an economy of movement.
I could have been theatrical. I could have thrown it into the fountain or shattered it on the concrete. I did none of those things. Instead, I slipped it off with the sort of calm that makes people uncomfortable because it refuses to rise to their emotional expectations. I placed it in a small box and held it out toward Marcus. I won't be a placeholder, I said. If you're going to choose someone for who they are, you can choose me now. If not, this is yours. Marcus stared at the ring, at the cloudy stone that had seemed like a pact, and I watched the way his face rearranged. There was pleading there, yes, but it was mixed with a dawning knowledge that he had to decide whether he would be a person or an instrument of his family's ambition. Please, he said, but the plea had a tone like wind around a building. The structure had been decided before the humans were asked. I handed the box back to him. It made a soft thud on the lectern, as if that small noise would resonate. He opened it, turned the ring in his fingers, and for a moment everything that had been beautiful in our quiet life seemed to be something else entirely. He looked at me as if to ask for a last concession that would permit him to join the ledger. I can't, I said. I can't be the thing they plan to retire. I refuse to be a placeholder. He looked at Patricia then, perhaps seeking guidance, compass, forgiveness. She had the expression of someone who had been caught in a tapestry she had mostly designed. For the first time, I saw the human cost of social calculation. I was not cruel enough to watch them fall. This was not revenge. This was truth meeting consequence. Elena, serious and efficient, extended the announcement that the manufacturer would notify the press of a formal audit once it reached certain procedural thresholds. That was how bureaucracies operate. They act, then they document. The very next morning, the news cycle picked up the first press release. Headlines were careful, citing an audit and vendor complaints. Within 48 hours, the dealership network's reputation had found its reflection in a series of cautious articles. There was no triumphant front-page vindication. There were facts and the glacial action of institutions moving to protect their supply chains and their reputations. Vivian was called into a meeting with the board of the dealership. Within days, under pressure from the manufacturer and the board's risk committee, she was asked to step aside from management pending the investigation. That was not a sentencing. It was an administrative maneuver. The press called it a resignation. The board called it a necessary separation. Either way, the family mechanisms that had relied on continuity suddenly found themselves with gaps. The Whitmore brand's glossy sheen dulled in the market the way a polished shoe loses a shine without constant care. Customers asked questions about parts availability. Vendors, who had been patient with late payments for years because of a wealth of social capital, began to require stricter terms. The practical consequences of the audit were financial and reputational, and they were immediate enough that a family used to transacting in privacy now found itself accounted for in public. My role in that was small and precise. I had brought a file to people prepared to judge it. I had not orchestrated punitive outcomes. I was not a public crusader. I was a woman who had asked for facts before committing her life to another. The manufacturer's suspension of shipments and the board's request that Vivian step down were institutional responses to institutional problems. They were not revenge. They were the consequences of discovered patterns. In the days that followed, the press called Richard. He gave a statement that was factual and measured, and when the inevitable interest turned toward me, he deflected. She asked for facts to be examined, he told a reporter. The rest is for procedures to determine. A few outlets tried to turn it into a soap opera. I declined interviews.
I asked politely and with the quiet insistence of someone who knows how to be firm that Richard and Alina keep my name out of their public statements. They agreed. People have asked me since whether I enjoyed watching the crack in the Whitmore facade widen. The honest answer is that I felt relief and a heavy sadness. Relief because the pattern of entitlement they had practiced had been shown for what it was. Sadness because the fallout affected people who did not deserve ruin for the sake of a lesson, and because even when institutions act, lives are altered. I had not wanted to be cruel. I had wanted to be clear. Marcus's family felt the consequences as blows. Harold Whitmore, the patriarch who had mostly watched his children navigate status like a sport, retreated into a strange private grief. He phoned Marcus the next day with a voice that had the low tone of someone surprised by their own family. "We mismanaged this," he said, and it registered not as contrition but as the first practical recognition that the machinery was not working. Patricia made public statements, careful, incomplete. She expressed surprise and promised cooperation. Vivian, humiliated by a process that had been made visible, posted a short statement about stepping aside to focus on family matters, a kind of corporate-sounding sorrow that people learned to read as the sentence before reinvention. Alexandra Castellano, who had been a presence in their planning more than a person in the room, released nothing from her end. Her name appeared in the press as a contact and associate. Rumors circled. She was not at the party that night. I would later learn that she had been warned off at the last minute, perhaps by her own counsel, perhaps by the same noise that has a way of redirecting those who prefer to keep their names clean. The public photograph of her with Marcus remained a stubborn record, unchanged by legal niceties. As the dust settled, friends reached out, not to celebrate, but to check on me. My grandmother's pendant lay against my chest like a steady heartbeat. I allowed myself quiet friendships, a dinner with Joanne, who made an exception to meet me, and who spoke in the kitchen of her own small indignations that had been swallowed for too long. Coffee with Elena, who was honest about the limits of corporate action and the quiet satisfactions of a job well done, and a long, awkward conversation with Richard, in which we agreed that he would answer the press without naming me, and that I would remain out of the frenzy. "You could have been louder," he told me once, when the thing had cooled enough for commentary. "People like spectacle." "I didn't want spectacle," I said. "I wanted them to be measured. I wanted facts to be the instrument." "You gave them the instrument," he said, and it worked. It did work, but it worked in a sober and administrated way. The manufacturer did not announce criminal charges. It announced an audit and a suspension. The board did not declare malfeasance. It accepted an executive's temporary absence pending inquiry. These were the kinds of consequences that changed the math of reputation and power without reducing anyone to a caricature. For me, they were meaningful because they prevented a pattern from continuing unchecked. Marcus tried to reach me in the days after the party. His messages ranged from confusion to apology to an increasingly brittle plea. One evening, he sent me a short text. "Can we meet, please? I need to explain. I need you to hear me." I kept my reply simple, not cruel, just decisive. "Later," I wrote, mirroring the delay-building habit that had saved me from impulsive ruin before. I knew that if he wanted to be complicit with his family's plans, there was nothing I could do to make him otherwise. If he wanted to be my partner, he had to choose actively, not passively. When the press began to make a bigger show of it, I made a deliberate request. Let the institutions do their work. If there were criminal matters, let investigators find them. If there were civil matters, let accountants and auditors trace the numbers. I did not want to be the person whose face carried the verdict. I had sacrificed my own name in the interest of clarity. It felt in a strange way like protection, from sensationalism, from being reduced to the moral of someone else's story. People asked if I had regretted letting them think I was poor and clueless. The truth is that I had never considered that a role. It was a condition I allowed to exist for a time because I wanted to see. The worth of a person is not determined by the value of their belongings. Margaret had taught me that. The point of the experiment was never to humiliate. It was to measure whether I would be treated as a person or a commodity. The result was what it was. There were private costs. Friends noticed my exhaustion. I had to remind myself that taking action is a kind of labor. I had to reconcile the fact that some relationships were now irrevocably altered. Marcus likely grieved a version of himself that had been pleasing to his family. Harold and Patricia lost a certain ease of public functioning. Vivian's career trajectory pivoted to uncertainty. Those were not satisfactions. They were consequences. I also returned to my life, my apartment bed smelled like lemon oil and the hum of my old refrigerator. I went back to work and found that code is a reassuring partner. It does not demand the kind of public emotion that people do. I walked to my office and closed the door and typed, and for a spell the world of transactions and audits seemed very far away. The pendant warmed against my chest as if to say, "Well done," and then simply went quiet again. One afternoon, the board of the dealership issued a statement. They acknowledged the manufacturer's inquiry and promised cooperation. Vivian released another statement, shorter, acknowledging that she would step aside. The dealership's general manager, a man who had once laughed at a vendor's pleas for timely payment, resigned. The market reacted in small ways. Shares ticked, suppliers tightened terms, customers asked questions. It was not ruin, it was accountability. In the weeks that followed, I got a message from a reporter who had been persistent and polite. He wanted to know my side of the story. "I appreciate discretion," he wrote. "If you grant me an interview, I'll be considerate." I declined. "I am not the story," I told him. "What matters are the documents." That refusal did not make me immune to curiosity about how things would play out. The human instinct is to want closure. But for me, closure came not as a headline, but as a quiet settling. One morning, I sat on my couch with my grandmother's pendant between my fingers and watched a local news segment that ran through the facts. Manufacturer inquiry, social posts, resignation. Richard had given a statement. Elena's team had been quoted. My name did not appear. I breathed, not triumphantly, but with a small, clean relief. Frequently, readers ask whether I felt justified to let them think I was poor and clueless. I do not celebrate deception. I used omission as a method to learn truth. There's a moral difference between entrapment and testing. Entrapment manufactures crime. My approach was evidence-gathering and discretion. When marriage means joining a system that might treat you as a transaction, you have a responsibility to ask whether that system will value your personhood. My choice was designed to protect that personhood. Months later, the formal audits produced a report that led to remedial measures, some board changes, and a careful re-examination of vendor contracts.
It did not, to my knowledge, produce criminal indictments. It produced, however, a reset in how the network handled vendor relationships. The manufacturer reinstated shipments only after the board demonstrated changes and oversight that satisfied their criteria. That was as close to institutional justice as this sort of situation often gets. Policy change, personnel reshuffling, reputational harm that requires work to mend. Vivian's professional life had to be rebuilt from a narrower place. She reached out once through a mutual acquaintance, with a note that read less like apology and more like an admission. I did not reply. My grandmother had taught me that forgiveness is a private thing, and it is also a gift you give on your own terms. Marcus tried to see me once after the sweep of public attention eased. He showed up at my apartment with flowers, in a way that still spoke of the man I had known before the ledger became his priority. We talked for an hour, awkward and honest. He admitted he had been passive, that he had allowed the family momentum to carry him into decisions. He said he wanted to understand. He said he wanted to be better. I listened. You might expect a romantic reconciliation in that hour. That is not how it went. There was no reconciliation because there was an enacted truth. People have to actively choose to be the people they wish to be. Marcus's desire to change was commendable, but it could not erase the months in which he had not asked questions. He left with no promise from me, but with a dignity that I wanted to preserve for both of us. I wanted him to choose for himself, and not because his life's lines had been redrawn in public. After he left, my phone buzzed. It was a message I had learned to regard with the same curiosity as any other artifact from a life that had once seemed simple. I read it for the last time, Marcus asking to meet, to explain, to try, and for the last time I put my thumb over it and deleted it. It was not an act of malice. It was an act of finality. Deleting the message was less a dramatic gesture than a practical one. I had given him enough chances to show himself. The rest would be his work. In the quiet that followed, I made tea and sat at the table with my grandmother's pendant resting heavy at my throat. The house was the same as it had always been, supportive furniture, the hum of daily life, but I felt a small, clean knowledge settling into me. I had honored Margaret's lessons, patience, evidence, dignity. Those were the tools I had used. They had not been glamorous. They had been honest. People sometimes ask what it is like to stand up to a family like the Whitmores. The short answer is that it is lonely and necessary. The long answer is that you learn to keep your center even as the world you thought you might enter rearranges itself. There is grief in the loss of what you imagined, and there is a brittle relief when the ledger is opened and found to be less pristine than it pretended. Both are true at once. My life after that returned to the ordinary kind of busy that sustains most of us. Code deployments, weekend runs, lending a hand to friends, and dinner dates with people who got to know me for who I was rather than what I was assumed to be. I kept Margaret's pendant. It kept its ordinary weight, and I carried it as a reminder of a woman who believed measurements of character were worth keeping. Once, months after the affair of audits and statements, I passed the Whitmore dealership on an ordinary errand. The flags out front were down. The manager's office had a for lease placard in the window for some smaller local vendor. I felt no gloating. I felt only the neutral sensation of observation, like someone noting the weather. Certain institutions had shifted, policies had been adjusted, the world ticked forward. I think of that night at the mahogany door often. I think of Patricia's half offer of help
and of Vivian's thinly veiled choices. I think of the 6 forks and the cloudy ring, and how small the gestures that reveal character can be. I think of the hallway where plans were spoken as if they were natural resources to be distributed. I think of the man who wanted to love me loudly when applause was ready, and quietly when it was not. I think of the photograph that was public, and the vendor statements that did not lie. And I think of Margaret, who would have approved in that exact way that meant she would have rolled her eyes at my dramatics and given me a small proud look for keeping my cool. She taught me that dignity is sometimes silence, and sometimes it is the quiet placing of a folder on a desk where someone in a suit and tie has to answer to it. If you watch this and it resonated, if you have been in a room where people decided your value for you, consider subscribing. There are more stories about how evidence, patience, and a refusal to be commodified can change the shape of a life. For me, the lesson is simple and steady. Know the terms, collect the facts, and protect the dignity that belongs only to you. The last thing I did before I closed that chapter completely was small and final. Marcus sent one last message, a line that read like apology and plea reversed. I pressed my thumb, felt the screen go dark, and deleted it. Then I made tea, put Margaret's pendant back around my neck, and felt quietly and undeniably that I had chosen myself.